Today is the second installment in our three-part series to kick off the second quarter build this year of Servoy. And I think this particular webinar has focuses a bit more on some new stuff that we had. And we're going to talk about layout managers, but instead of just talking about what's brand new, because people might be joining with various levels of experience, I thought we'd sort of rewind a bit and just sort of look at holistically what are the different ways to build forms in Servoy and what are the different layout managers that we offer. So in order to do that, I'm going to do three demos. I'm going to demo the sort of simple layout manager we call, which is based on CSS positioning. Then I'll show the 12 grid layout, which is for building responsive and adaptive applications. And then I'll show the newest addition to the layout manager family, which is the Flex layout container, which allows us to do some other interesting things. And what I hope at the end of this webinar is that you sort of understand what each one does and why you might use each one, and a little bit about how you could use it and how you could mix them together. With that out of the way, why don't we jump into our first demo? And I've switched over to a solution that I'm recycling from an older webinar. We launched the CSS positioning in 8.4, which was about 6 months ago. This is just a review of that positioning system, and it's really based on kind of location within a container, either based on pixel location or a relative percentage location. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to minimize this window, and what I've put on some of these labels here are what we've put into the positioning system in terms of instructions. And it really goes top, right, bottom, left, width, and height. And those, if they're just numbers, they could be in pixels, but they could also be in percentages and be calculated. And as I sort of minimize this, you can see that things are growing and shrinking with the screen size. And I could also do this top and bottom. So for example, you can see that this middle label here is kind of hovering right at the 50% mark, top to bottom. Whereas these two panels with the buttons or with the labels and fields in them are hovering or growing and shrinking to kind of occupy 50% of this allocated area. So they're split up equally. And this was all done without any of the more complex like grid system. It's just done with that relative CSS positioning. And really what you can see is that it's either pixel location or in this case, it's a bit of a combination. You calculate for the top here, it's going to be 50% down, but then 10 pixels lower. For example, here, the right position is going to be 80% of the way from the right side of the screen plus another 10 pixels. And it's those little plus pixels that get us the nice little margins here between the different panels that we're showing. I didn't have to do that with CSS, like, you know, margin and padding or everything. I just did that with purely with positioning. So show you another example of how this might look with a real screen. You can see that as I grow this, the fields themselves are kind of occupying 50% each of this space, whereas the grid below is occupying kind of 100% of this inner space, but the grid over here stays at a percentage width of the total screen. So it gives you a lot of control without having to really dive too deep, without having to write any code or do any special layout tricks. And at the end of this, we'll take a look under the hood at that. I wanted to sort of talk a bit about the responsive layout as it can mix with a simple layout. We won't get yet into full responsive using the 12 grid system, but this is using the grid system to set up how the containers will be, but inside we still have this simple layout mechanism. So you can see that I have 3 different containers here, each of which are going to be responsive to the screen size. But the content inside is positioned with the simple layout mechanism. So just doing the pixel coordinate or the percentage coordinate location from the edges or width and height. And what I'm going to do now is, again, I'm going to start to minimize this. And what you're going to see is something you can't do with simple position alone. You actually need to do the responsive, because what responsive means is that it adapts to the screen size. So as I narrow this screen, you'll notice that at some point the map drops below the other 2 containers. And I can't remember if I keep going. Yeah, I do all 3 if I keep going. So, for example, if this were on a phone, you get a layout like this. But if you look at it on a desktop, you get it exploded this way. So in order to really have a layout that responds to the screen size, you have to use the grid system, which is definitely more complex and a bit more work to lay out. The good news is that since Servoy 8.4, you've been able to mix the 2 of those and actually put the simple layout inside the containers. And I'll show you under the hood what that looks like as well. So let's dive into the IDE for a moment and have a look. So in the first example, let me just clear some space here. You can see that it's just really based on this CSS positioning property. And if I expand that, you can see that it is really top, right, bottom, and left. And that will be, pixels from any of those edges, or if they're not specified, it'll use the width and the height. It'll ignore the width and the height if you don't set the left, right, and the top, bottom in such a way. One thing that we added in this latest release is going back to earlier versions of Servoy. We had something called anchoring, which kind of predated exposing CSS positioning right here in the developer. And you were able to just kind of right-click an element and anchor it where you want it in the form. Of course, CSS positioning is almost sort of a superset of that. It lets you do more. But if you wanted to quickly do the anchoring, we brought back the context menu. So now you can do, anchoring and pick top, left, right, bottom, etc., or do it this way. And what that will do is it will calculate for you what the CSS position coordinates should be, and it'll plug them into that value. So if you're used to that feature or you want a little shortcut, you can do that, and you can do that on select a bunch of elements at once and choose the anchoring from all of them, and it will calculate that for you. The other thing to point out is I'm going to select this one that actually has a calculated value, and if I click the button here, it'll show a little dialog which will sort of plug that in for you. So you don't have to type it in perfect yourself. If you want to just use the dialog, you can. Excuse me. So that is the simple view. The other example we showed sort of a form. And what you can see is that I have like a grid over here, a grid component on this form, and if I look at the position of that, again, it's doing a bit of relative positioning here. It's doing about 2/3 the way over from the right edge. So that's why that grid was growing and shrinking, but only proportional to the whole screen. Whereas, for example, some of these fields are doing 1/3 of the screen size, plus a bit of padding here of 20 pixels. So you can see that that's why those sort of looked equal space and they were growing together. So that's kind of a real world view of how you do it. If you look at the grid down here, it'll again look like you can see that the left coordinate is 2/3 the way in to pick up where this one left off, but the right coordinate is going to just be 10 pixels from the edge. So it gives you that level of control, and it's pretty easy to understand and to plug those values in. The third example that I showed was a mix. And in this one, you'll notice that we've actually placed some of the 12 grid stuff on the form. I'm going to switch a demo in a minute and sort of explain how the 12 grid works. But what I wanted to show here is that the simple positioning system can be used inside the grid system so that you don't have to go really deep in responsive layout design. You can kind of specify the rules for your screen kind of at large and then fill it in with some of the easier stuff. And so what we really have here are these three responsive columns, and they do different things at different sizes. But inside them, what we've done is we've placed this component called a CSS Position Container, and you can find that right here on the palette. You could drag and drop it into a responsive container. You could also right-click a responsive container, and I'll do it down here. Right-click and add, and then you could pick it from this menu as well. I like to often work on the outline at the right. It helps me see things more clearly. So really everything that's inside, and something that we've added that works really nicely is the zoom. So if I were to click on one of these CSS positions, let me get the first one, and I can right click here and zoom in full editor, or you can see there's a zoom button up here, which we added in this latest release. So there's a little context. There's several ways to do it. It'll actually drill in and let you just use kind of the classic simple layout positioning form editor here for dragging and dropping and positioning your components without having to worry about the outer structure. So really, if you say this is the rules of my form with a few responsive containers, you can zoom in and the rest can be just done more simply. These are, you can just drag and drop these. You don't have that more cumbersome hierarchy. And when you're done doing that, you just click zoom out with that magnifying glass button, and it'll re-render the form back in the responsive view. So that's kind of how you mix and match the two. I do want to just kind of touch on the 12 grid system for those that might be new to it, and explain a bit more detail how it works. So I'm going to activate another solution, which if you're new to Servoy is like an application or a project that I have in my workspace, and I'm going to go ahead and launch that. Okay. So as I said before, the responsive design, or I seem to have double-clicked the launch button and it killed one of the sessions. There's the other one. Okay. So as I said before, the responsive design, or the responsive layout manager, or the responsive grid system is a grid system that lets you design how components will behave depending on the screen size. It's the depending on the screen size that is the important part, and the main reason you want to use this is you want to support different size devices. So in the 12 grid system, there's really a few viewports, and what I'm going to do is sort of minimize this and click and drag and show you the different sizes. So there's the large viewport, and what you'll see is that some of these I have set rules on, and as it gets smaller, they're going to take up different spaces in the grid system depending on the viewport size. So as I kind of shrink down to medium viewport, you can see that the first two, 1 and 2, instead of taking up half of the grid, they now take up a full row, but they stack one under the other. And that's the medium viewport. That could be a small laptop or a large tablet. This could be a tablet. And now you can see 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 did the same thing. And as I keep going, this could be the extra small viewport could be a phone. Anything below that is extra small. And just to give you an idea of what that could look like in a real world example, again, here's a bit of data bound stuff. These are just customer records from a sample database. And what I want to show here is that as we go down, one of these responsive containers having simple layout stuff inside them, there you go. You can see that at a small viewport, they stack. Same three things and they stack. But if I keep going, I might want to set a rule that the customer chooser is going to hide at the extra small viewport. So you can see that that list box that allows me to select the customer, it shows up in the small viewport, but it's gone in the extra small viewport. So you may want to have things showing and hiding or changing depending on the viewport size. And that's what the responsive layout manager gives you. And I don't want to get too much into how it works, but just to look at the one example we had. You can see that there's quite some nesting in the outline here, but it's really that I had 4 rows and then each row had some columns in it. And it's these classes here, these XS12, LG12, those are all indicating what it's going to do at different sizes. I probably should make this bigger so you can read it. And you can see that that some of these are going to take up the full size for everything, whereas I start to put, let me see here. Some of these, like LG6, means it takes up half of the grid because it's a 12 grid system once you are in the large viewport, but as you shrink down and you go to medium, it takes up the whole thing. And so the one next to it will stack, which is what we saw with some of those buttons. And then going farther down, you can see there's some more rules about how, well, it takes up 1/3 of the grid at a medium, half the grid at a small, and then the whole row at extra small. So just by simply adding some of those style classes, you can dictate what's going to happen. There's also, you'll notice that the text wasn't really switching here. I was actually showing and hiding the different buttons for the viewport here, and some of these style classes I've added are visible MD block. What that indicates is that it's going to be visible only at medium, and then by default it's hidden. So each one of those, as I was scrolling in the application here, and you can see that it changes the actual text, it's really showing and hiding those based on the screen size. So it's that you can change where it positions or how much space it takes up, and also whether it shows or hides, and that's kind of the gist of it. So that kind of catches you up to a bit of where we are today, and also a bit of the new stuff. What I'd like to do is go into the Flex Layout Manager or container, which we added just in this last release. And it's a bit different than responsive. It still feels like responsive. It's still dynamic, but it has a bit more to do with content and for like how different parts of the screen flow and maybe push things out of the way, how space is allocated, where the 12 grid system is very rigid. It takes up a certain percentage of the grid, and that switches on or off depending on the viewport. The flex layout is not depending really on the viewport. It's more about how much space is available and how that gets allocated. And so let's first start by launching this one. Okay, so here we have kind of 3 containers on the form. And what I want to show you is what changing some of the properties do. So we have here a flex container, on the form. I should give a bit more room here so you can see. And then inside the flex container, there are 3 flex items. And so the container kind of controls how space is distributed. The first and probably most obvious is the direction. So I could switch that from row to column, and you can see that it's going to stack them instead of arranging them. And if I save that, it'll broadcast it into the client. The other thing, I'm going to put that back to row. The other thing is how it justifies. So I want the leftover space. Now this is driven by content, so it's really the size of those buttons, and I've specified that through some CSS. It's really the size, and it's also specified by the content itself, how much text is there. That drives how much space is left over, and the container decides how to distribute that space. So you may want to say that I want all of the space between the components to be allocated equally. So you'll see what that'll do as I save it and let it broadcast in here, is that it pushes the items, and the flex items have the gray border, whereas the actual content are these blue buttons. It pushes them to the edges of the sort of that layout, and it evenly distributes all of the space in between the items. I'm going to change that to something a little kind of subtly different, which is I want to evenly distribute the space around the items. So now the space around outside the items is evenly distributed. So between the left edge and the right edge. And then space evenly means all, also subtly different, that these spaces here, the 4 spaces are all even. So the kind of the margin area here and in between is all the same. The other thing you can control is where do these things align within the container. Right now they're aligned center, and you can see there they are vertically aligned center. I could say that they're going to align to the start, which depends really on the direction. So in this case, it would be the top. And if I want to switch that to the bottom, I go to flex end. And now you can see that they're lining up along the bottom. The other thing you could do is say, well, they're going to stretch. And so now you can see that the item itself, the flex item or the inner container, is really stretched top to bottom. It doesn't so much affect how the content shows up unless the content itself is also having some relative positioning. Maybe it grows or you know, that depends on what you put in there, but it's more the rule of how that space will get allocated. And there's something called baseline, which will line things up sort of on, it will look the same as center in this view, but it lines it up sort of on the baseline of the text here. The other thing you have control over is inside the items themselves. One is how components will align inside the items, and it's really the same properties. Another thing you might want to do is say, I want to let leftover space be allocated specifically to one item. So let's say I had in the third flex item here with the big button, I want to say that one's going to grow 1, and what that means is sort of like 1 multiple or 1 division of the leftover space. And now you can see by looking at the gray area, this is how much space is really allocated to that container. The height is driven by the content, and the width is normally driven by the content, but now the width is driven by how much space is left over, and everything else gets squeezed. If I also set, say the first one to grow by a factor of 1, now you can see that these two are equally spaced to take over the leftover space, and this one only has enough space for its content. And what I could do is say, yeah, but I want the big button to have 2 times the space of the small button. So I'll set that one to 2. So it's really going to be 2 to 1 to 0 multiples of the leftover space. So now you can see that this one grows a bit, this one grows double of that, and this one stays. So it really gives you control. A use case I could think of would be that you have sections of the screen where you want to make them behave differently depending on the content and have different rules. Another area we see is where you just have a flow of, say, some buttons, and you want to, they may take up different space depending on the content that's in them, or some kinds of data-driven labels. It's really all about content. It's not about like the grid system, which is very top-down, or the CSS position, which is very absolute. This is more really driven by the content. The good news is that you could combine this layout manager also with the other one. So this is, by default, this is on a responsive form, which means you could go ahead and add this into the grid system, for example, and this could just be one small part of a larger form that is based on the grid system, but the content inside is going to drive what happens just within that layout manager. You could also put in a positioning panel, say inside one of these. This was the use case I thought I'd like to show you if I had more time, is to take the simple layout, put it inside this, like I did with the grid system, and then show you how you could arrange those with that. But again, it makes more sense that it's all kind of responsive because it's content driven. One other thing I'll show you is I'm going to set the justify to center, and I'm going to turn off the grow for both of these. Oops. Yeah, that should put them. And then what I want to do is I want to actually hide these buttons and show you how things can collapse in on one another. You're still going to see the container, but I sort of made it so that if I push this button, it toggles it. You see the little container here because I've styled it that way, and you can see the margins. The container itself isn't gone, but typically you wouldn't see this, the container. You wouldn't style it so that it's visible. But you can see that the space is actually removed, except for the padding and the margins and stuff. And if I click this, it toggles it back. So that's how you could say you had some flowing content, but depending on something from the data, some things are showing and hiding, and you don't want to leave holes in your screen, and you also don't want to write a bunch of code to repositioning things or dynamically add and remove style classes, etc. This flows more based on content, and that's kind of the point. So those are the demos. I can jump into some slides while you guys think of some questions, and we'll just do a quick overview of what we saw. So far and away, the easiest and most common way that people are building applications with Servoy is with a simple layout. It's all based on the position of an element within the parent container, and it's really those six coordinate positions, which are top, right, bottom, left, and then width and height. And depending on what you put in for them, for example, width and height will be overridden if both left and right are put in. But if you were to just say put left and then not right, but you put a width, you know that it's going to sort of anchor left at a certain width. So that really gives you control about where things sit within a container, unless you do a lot of, sort of fluid kinds of layouts without getting into some of the more complicated layout managers. Another thing you can do is you can use those relative positioning. So you can see that I have the child element, which is positioned 25 pixels, 25% from the left, but then we also want that little padding of 10 pixels. Well, then we just put in calc 25% plus 10. And so you have these different calculation rules which let you get a bit more nuanced. Just sort of skip over that. I think that's obvious. one thing I really wanted to make sure you understood is that in one of those examples, I showed responsive containers that actually contained some of the simple layouts. So the way that works is you just have a responsive container. It could be like the grid system, and it could be a column within the 12 grid system, but inside that you just have a regular CSS position panel. And you saw that in the form designer, I was able to zoom in and zoom out of that. So you really would want to use the responsive layout if you want to have rules about how things are going to look depending on screen size. It's really ideal for those multi-channel applications, web, tablet, phone, and you want to kind of have one screen that looks right on different devices. That's the main use case for doing responsive. If you don't need that, I really recommend that you do not use responsive because it adds a bit of overhead. It's a bit more complicated. There's a bit more nesting, as you saw. So I would say stay away from responsive for pure desktop browser type applications. The flex layout is really based on content, and it's really about how your screens flow with the content. We saw that there's rules really on how space is allocated between content or within the containers inside the main layout container. So it's if you have stuff which is really content driven, where the content is going to be changing, then you want to go for the flex layout, and you can drop that in on any responsive form. Keep in mind that it's not adaptive to screen sizes, so it's not like the 12 grid system. So it's not like you can say I want my flex layout manager to look this way on mobile and this way on a desktop, but you can easily mix it with the 12 grid system, which can control that. There's one other thing I wanted to point out, and this was for those of you that are Servoy experts. I hope you noticed that every time I was launching the client, I was actually launching the NG desktop client. And this is one more announcement that I wanted to make in terms of our offerings this quarter with the latest version of Servoy. The NG desktop client is the same NG client that I could run if I launched this in my browser. So I could launch this in Chrome. And you can see that I get this right here in my browser with my address bar. But what I was doing today, which was launching this in the NG desktop client, which actually puts an icon down here in my system tray. I've launched several of these. I should clean this up. It puts an icon down here in my system tray, and I get a native, I'm on Windows 10. I get a native Windows application that has the application that I built embedded in it. So it's still a pure HTML5 CSS type application, but it's now embedded in a native window, which gives me some things. This is just the sort of bare metal version of our NG desktop, but we'll be shipping this with every future version of Servoy, and we'll begin to add plugins that allow you to get to the desktop itself. So for example, file system access, access to hardware, access to things like scanners or installed software, executing system commands, that type of thing. What you normally cannot get with a browser application, you'll be able to start to make those, bridge that gap by running the NG desktop client here. What we're going to have in the future for that too is also the ability to come in here and file export and actually generate the binary that you could distribute to your customers or your users that they could then put on, just install as a regular executable on. It still connects to an application server, so it still fully runs over the internet. It's just a nice way to distribute an application, and if you really need those desktop features and the desktop integration, you can have that. So I wanted to point that out, that I was doing that with each time here when I launched a demo, and that is now available for you to try out with your applications, and we'll be adding plugins to that with every release and perhaps in between every release, because we can actually update that without updating the Servoy core. So that's pretty nice.